It's been over 2 years since it all went down, and even now, there are days I catch myself replaying everything in my head. The way it started feels so ordinary, almost boring, like the calm before a storm you didn't see coming. I was 29, working as a systems analyst, living in a decent apartment on the edge of the city. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. Then I met her. Her name was Rachel, and she had this kind of energy that could light up a room without even trying. She was 27, sharp, confident, and had a laugh that made people around her join in whether they wanted to or not. We met at a trivia night my coworker dragged me to, and by the end of the evening, we were exchanging numbers. It wasn't like some romantic comedy where sparks fly immediately, but there was this natural connection between us that felt easy, comfortable, real. Our relationship started fast but never felt rushed. We clicked in a way I hadn't experienced before. She was ambitious, working as a project manager for a nonprofit, and had this knack for making everyone feel heard. When we talked, it felt like she genuinely wanted to know me, not just the surface stuff, but the real me. I remember the first time I met her family. It was 6 months in, and she brought me to her parents' house for a Sunday barbecue. Her dad, Greg, was the kind of guy who shook your hand too hard and held eye contact just a little too long, like he was sizing you up. Her mom, Diane, was polite but had this passive-aggressive edge. She asked a lot of questions about my job and made comments like, "It's nice that you've built a career for yourself without any family connections. That must be hard." Then there were her brothers, Matt and Tyler. They were a few years younger than Rachel, but had this over-the-top protectiveness that felt more territorial than caring. Tyler kept asking about my intentions, like he'd stepped out of some Victorian novel, and Matt barely spoke to me, just stared like he was waiting for me to mess up. I laughed it off at the time, thinking it was typical family awkwardness. Every family's got its quirks, right? Besides, Rachel seemed embarrassed by them, rolling her eyes whenever Diane or Tyler said something pointed. "They'll warm up to you," she told me later. "They're just being ridiculous." I believed her. I wanted to believe her. By the time we hit our 1-year anniversary, I was sure Rachel was the one. I proposed on a quiet night in my apartment. It wasn't elaborate, just us, a bottle of wine, and a simple question. She said yes, tears in her eyes, and hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. We kept the engagement low-key for a while, but eventually, Diane insisted on throwing us an engagement party. I didn't want to make waves, so I agreed. The party was at their house, a big suburban place with spotless white furniture and family photos everywhere. Rachel seemed genuinely excited, so I did my best to match her energy, even though I felt out of place. Diane was in her element, playing hostess and subtly reminding everyone that this was her daughter's engagement. Greg stayed in the background most of the time, drinking beer and nodding along to conversations. Matt and Tyler hung around like guard dogs, shooting me side glances whenever Rachel wasn't looking. The party should have been a celebration, but it left me with this strange, uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. It wasn't any one thing, more like a collection of small moments. Diane's comments about how Rachel needed someone stable to support her dreams. Tyler's offhand remark about how marriage is a big responsibility, don't screw it up. Even Rachel seemed a little off, distracted, or maybe just tense from being around her family. But I brushed it all aside. Rachel was the person I loved, not her family. I told myself things would smooth out over time. Once we were married, they'd see how much I cared about her, how committed I was. Looking back, I wish I'd paid more attention to those little moments, the subtle warnings that things weren't as perfect as I wanted to believe. At the time, though, I was all in. Rachel was my future, and nothing else mattered. For the next few months, life felt like it was on fast forward. Wedding planning consumed most of our free time, and while it was stressful, we were doing it together. Or so I thought. It wasn't until about 8 months into the engagement that I started noticing cracks. They were small at first. Rachel asking me why I hadn't texted her back during lunch, or who I was meeting for coffee after work. It didn't feel like jealousy exactly, more like suspicion. "Is everything okay?" I asked her one night when she'd been unusually quiet. She waved it off. "Yeah, just stressed. Work's been crazy, and this wedding is so much to handle." I wanted to believe her, so I let it go. But something about her tone stuck with me, like there was more she wasn't saying. It all came to a head one Saturday afternoon when she showed up at my apartment unannounced. She looked upset, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "We need to talk," she said, her voice tense. Those 4 words always make your stomach drop. I put down the laundry I was folding and gestured for her to sit, but she didn't move. Instead, she shoved her phone in my face. On the screen were a few grainy photos of me leaving a cafe with a coworker, Melissa. I blinked, trying to process what I was looking at. "That's Melissa," I said slowly. "We had lunch last week to talk about work. What's this about?" Rachel folded her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it was lunch," I said, confused. "I didn't think it was a big deal." Her expression hardened. "Not a big deal? So you just casually go out with other women and don't think I deserve to know?" The accusation hit me like a slap. "Rachel, it was work. We were discussing a project. That's all." She wasn't hearing me. "Do you think I'm stupid? I've seen this before. Guys acting all innocent while sneaking around behind their girlfriends' backs. Don't lie to me." I stared at her, stunned. This was Rachel, the woman who used to look at me like I was her whole world. Now she was glaring at me like I was some stranger who'd betrayed her. "I'm not lying," I said firmly. "If you're upset, I can show you our emails. It's all work-related. There's nothing to hide." But that only seemed to make her angrier. "Emails? Great. So now you're covering your tracks." It was like talking to a brick wall. No matter what I said, she wasn't listening. And then, for the first time, I felt the weight of something bigger pressing down on me. This wasn't just Rachel being upset. It was something else entirely. Something I didn't understand yet, but could feel creeping in, ready to destroy everything. I stood there, still holding the phone she'd shoved in my face, trying to understand how we'd gone from planning a life together to this. Rachel's accusations didn't just hurt. They made me question everything. "Rachel," I said, setting the phone on the counter, "why are you doing this? When have I ever given you a reason not to trust me?" She crossed her arms tighter, like she was holding herself together. "I don't know," she said, her voice sharp. "Maybe I don't know you as well as I thought I did." That hit like a gut punch. "You're serious? After everything we've been through, you'd rather believe a couple of blurry photos than me?" She didn't answer. Instead, she just stared at me, her eyes full of something I couldn't recognize. Anger? Fear? I couldn't tell anymore. "Rachel, come on." I tried again, softening my tone. "If you really think I'm capable of whatever this is, why didn't you just ask me first? Why come in here like this?" Her jaw tightened. "Because I wanted to see how you'd react. And now I know." I shook my head, frustration boiling over. "Know what? That I'm telling you the truth? That this is insane? What's going on with you? This isn't like you." Her silence felt heavier than any argument could have. That's when something clicked in my mind. The photos, her sudden distrust. It didn't add up. Rachel wasn't the kind of person to jump to conclusions without a reason. But she wasn't acting on her own, was she? "This isn't you," I said, my voice firmer now. "This is Diane, isn't it? She's been in your ear, hasn't she?" Rachel's eyes flashed, just for a second, before she quickly looked away. That split second was all the confirmation I needed. "Unbelievable," I muttered, laughing bitterly. "Your mom pulls some stunt, and you just go along with it? Do you even hear yourself right now?" Rachel stepped closer, her voice rising. "Don't bring my mom into this. She's not the one sneaking around with some woman." I ran a hand through my hair, feeling the frustration burn in my chest. "You're right," I snapped. "She's not sneaking around. She's sitting at home, coming up with ways to tear us apart, and it's working. Congratulations." Rachel's face hardened. "If you don't want to take responsibility for your actions, that's on you. But don't you dare blame my family." "Fine," I said, throwing my hands up. "Let's call it what it is. You don't trust me. Not enough to ask me for the truth, not enough to hear me out, and definitely not enough to see through whatever game your mom is playing. So why are we even doing this?" She flinched at that, but before she could respond, a loud banging on the door cut through the tension. It wasn't a polite knock. It was aggressive, like someone wanted to break the door down. "What the hell?" I said, moving toward the door. Rachel didn't stop me. She didn't even look surprised. When I opened it, Greg, Matt, and Tyler stormed in like a freight train. Greg was in front, his face red with anger, and the brothers were right behind him, looking just as pissed. "You think you can cheat on my daughter and get away with it?" Greg roared, jabbing a finger in my chest. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice rising in disbelief. "This is a misunderstanding. I didn't cheat on Rachel." Matt stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "So now you're calling Rachel a liar? That's bold, man." "No, I'm saying someone's feeding her lies." I shot back, trying to keep my distance. "If you'd give me 2 minutes to explain." Greg cut me off, shoving me hard enough that I stumbled back. "I don't need your excuses, boy. Men like you don't deserve women like my daughter." And then the first punch landed. It was fast and brutal, square on my jaw, and I barely had time to process it before Matt grabbed my shirt and shoved me into the wall. The impact knocked a lamp to the floor, and the sharp crack of glass breaking made me flinch. "Admit it," Tyler shouted, stepping in to throw a punch of his own. "Admit you've been sneaking around behind her back." "I didn't," I yelled, trying to shield myself as the blows kept coming. "I swear to God, I didn't cheat." But they didn't care. They weren't here to listen. They were here to teach me a lesson, to make me pay for something I hadn't even done. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Rachel standing near the doorway, arms crossed. She wasn't screaming or trying to stop them. She wasn't even crying. She just watched, cold, detached, like this was some reality show she wasn't a part of. That hurt more than any punch or kick. At some point, I ended up on the floor, curled into myself, trying to protect my head and ribs. My body felt like it was on fire, and I couldn't tell if the pounding in my ears was from the beating or my own racing heart. Finally, Greg pulled back, breathing heavily. "That's enough," he said to his sons, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Let's go before we really hurt him." As they headed for the door, Greg looked down at me one last time. "Stay away from my daughter," he growled. "If I see you near her again, I won't hold back next time." Rachel followed them out, but before she left, she glanced back at me, her voice flat. "The engagement's off," she said. "You're lucky they didn't do worse." And then she was gone. I lay there on the floor for what felt like hours, my chest heaving, my body throbbing with pain. The apartment was trashed, furniture overturned, a broken lamp, blood smeared on the carpet. I stared up at the ceiling, trying to process what had just happened, but all I could think was, this can't be real. This can't be my life. I don't know how long I lay there before I found the strength to move. Every part of my body ached, and it felt like even breathing took effort. My apartment was a wreck, but it was nothing compared to what was going on in my head. Rachel had stood there and watched. Not a word, not a single protest, just silence. That silence hurt more than any punch. Eventually, I dragged myself to my phone, my hands trembling. I called Ben. He answered on the second ring, and the concern in his voice was immediate. "What's going on? Can you come over?" I said, my voice weak. "It's bad." He didn't ask questions. "I'm on my way." When Ben arrived, his face went pale as soon as he saw me. "Jesus Christ," he said, taking in the bruises, the blood, the mess. "What the hell happened?" I tried to explain as best I could, but my words felt jumbled. "Rachel's family. They think I cheated. They beat the crap out of me." Ben sat me down and grabbed some ice from the freezer. "We're going to the hospital," he said firmly. I wanted to argue, but I didn't have the energy. At the hospital, the doctor patched me up, bruised ribs, a split lip, and what he called mild but concerning signs of a concussion. When I told him how it happened, his face darkened. "You need to report this," he said. "People don't just stop at something like this unless they're held accountable." I nodded, though part of me wasn't sure I had it in me to face them again. Ben stayed the night, refusing to leave me alone. The next morning, over coffee, he brought it up again. "You can't let them get away with this, man. I know it sucks, but you have to go to the police. They didn't just cross a line, they obliterated it." He was right. As much as I wanted to bury the whole thing and pretend it didn't happen, I couldn't let them think they could do this to me, or anyone else. I went to the police station that afternoon, filed a report, and let them take photos of my injuries. The officer taking my statement was sympathetic but professional. "We'll investigate," she said. "But be prepared, it might take some time." As I was leaving the station, my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. Normally, I wouldn't have answered, but something told me to pick up. "Hey, it's Mark," the voice on the other end said. Mark was Rachel's uncle, someone I'd only met once at a family gathering. He'd been quiet, almost invisible in the background, and I barely remembered him. "Why are you calling me?" I asked, suspicion creeping into my voice. "We need to talk," he said. "I know what happened, and I think you deserve to know the truth. Can we meet?" I hesitated, unsure if I could trust him, but curiosity got the better of me. "Fine. Where?" We met at a diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where nobody would bother you. Mark was already sitting in a booth when I arrived, sipping coffee and looking uneasy. "Thanks for meeting me," he said as I slid into the seat across from him. "Just get to the point," I said. "Why are you here?" He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Look, I don't condone what happened to you. I told Greg and the boys they were out of line, but no one listens to me in that family. What you need to know is that this wasn't some heat-of-the-moment thing. It was planned." I stared at him, not sure I'd heard him right. "What do you mean, planned?" Mark sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "Diane's been trying to break you and Rachel up for months. She doesn't think you're good enough for Rachel. She wanted Rachel to marry this guy from her social circle, a lawyer or something, rich, connected. Diane didn't like that Rachel was choosing someone outside of what she calls their class." I felt my jaw clench, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "So she set me up?" "Pretty much," Mark said, looking guilty. "She hired a guy to follow you. Those photos of you with that coworker? Diane paid someone to take them and make it look like you were sneaking around. Then she started feeding Rachel lies about how you couldn't be trusted." My hands gripped the edge of the table as I tried to keep my voice steady. "And Rachel just believed her?" "She's always been easy to manipulate when it comes to Diane," Mark said. "It's like she can't see her mom for who she really is." I leaned back, letting out a bitter laugh. "Unbelievable. And you're just telling me this now?" Mark looked down at his coffee. "I didn't know how bad it would get. When I heard about what Greg and the boys did, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Here." He slid a USB drive across the table. "This has everything. Texts, emails, even receipts from the guy Diane hired. She didn't exactly cover her tracks." I picked up the drive, turning it over in my hand. "Why are you doing this? What's in it for you?" Mark sighed. "Let's just say I've been on the receiving end of Diane's schemes before. I know how far she's willing to go to get what she wants. You didn't deserve this." I nodded slowly, unsure what else to say. "Thanks, I guess." When I got home, I plugged the USB into my laptop and started going through the files. What I saw made my stomach turn. There it was, in black and white, proof that Diane had orchestrated everything. Texts where she bragged to a friend about taking care of Rachel's little mistake. Emails to the photographer with specific instructions. Messages to Rachel, carefully planting seeds of doubt about me. It was sickening. I forwarded everything to my lawyer that night. "This is big," he said when I called him. "We're not just looking at assault anymore. This is conspiracy, and we have the evidence to back it up." For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had the upper hand. They thought they could break me, but they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The fallout came faster than I expected. Once my lawyer handed over the evidence to the police, things started moving quickly. The USB drive wasn't just a smoking gun. It was a full-on arsenal. The texts, emails, and receipts painted a clear picture of Diane's scheme, and when combined with my statement and the photos of my injuries, the case was airtight. It didn't take long for word to get back to Rachel's family. At first, it was radio silence. No calls, no texts, nothing. Then, the desperate attempts to smooth things over began. Greg was the first to break the silence. He left a voicemail that sounded almost unrecognizable compared to the man who'd stormed into my apartment. "Listen," he started, his tone forced and nervous. "Maybe we all overreacted. We just want what's best for Rachel. Let's be adults about this and work it out. No need to drag this into court." I didn't bother responding. A day later, Tyler sent a text. Look, man, I know things got out of hand, but we were just protecting Rachel. Can we talk? We don't want this to ruin anyone's lives. The sheer audacity of it made me laugh out loud. I ignored him too. But then there was Diane. She didn't call or text me directly. Of course not. Instead, she had another family member, a distant cousin I barely remembered meeting, approach me outside my office. Hey, he said, jogging up to me as I was heading to my car. Can we talk for a second? I stopped, already annoyed. What do you want? He smiled, that fake, overly polite smile people use when they know they're about to ask for something. Look, the family feels terrible about what happened. Nobody wants this to go to court. It's just going to get ugly for everyone. They're willing to cover your medical bills and offer a settlement if you agree to drop the charges. I stared at him for a moment, letting his words hang in the air. They think they can pay me off? I asked, my voice sharp. The cousin held up his hands defensively. I'm just the messenger. I'm saying it doesn't have to go this far. Everyone makes mistakes, right? Mistakes? I repeated, stepping closer. A mistake is spilling coffee on someone. This wasn't a mistake. It was an ambush. Tell them I'll see them in court. I turned and got into my car, leaving him standing there looking flustered. The calls didn't stop. Even Rachel tried reaching out, this time through emails and messages from a new number. Her tone shifted from defensive to regretful, then to outright desperate. I didn't know what my mom was planning, one email read. I swear I thought the photos were real. I'm so sorry. Please, can we talk? I couldn't even bring myself to reply. She'd had every chance to ask me for the truth before her family wrecked my apartment and left me bleeding on the floor. Now she wanted to explain herself? It was too little, too late. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. My lawyer called to tell me that arrest warrants had been issued for Greg, Tyler, Matt, and Diane. They were being charged with assault and conspiracy, and the police weren't wasting time. Apparently, Greg and Tyler didn't take their arrests gracefully. When the cops showed up at their house, Greg tried to argue, insisting they'd been defending Rachel's honor. Tyler, ever the hothead, demanded to see the evidence, yelling that this was all a misunderstanding. The officers weren't having it. They'd seen the evidence, seen the messages, the photos, and the proof that Diane had orchestrated the whole thing. Their excuses fell flat. Diane's reaction, though, was almost laughable. She tried to play the victim, telling the police she'd just been worried about Rachel and didn't mean for things to go this far. But the texts and emails told a very different story, one where she planned every detail of the setup. A day after the arrests, Rachel left me a voicemail. Her voice was shaky, like she'd been crying for hours. I don't even know where to start, she said. I didn't know what they were planning. I swear, I didn't. I thought you cheated, and I didn't know how to handle it. Please, I need to talk to you. I need to explain. I listened to the whole thing, then deleted it without a second thought. My lawyer was thrilled with how the case was shaping up. This isn't just strong, he said during one of our calls. It's a slam dunk. They assaulted you based on fabricated evidence, and we've got proof of the conspiracy. They're going to regret ever laying a hand on you. Hearing that felt good, but it didn't erase the bitterness in my chest. No matter how this played out in court, the damage was done. Rachel and her family had shown me exactly who they were, and I couldn't unsee it. The next week, I got another knock at my door. This time, it was Ben, holding a six-pack of beer and a takeout bag. Thought you could use a distraction, he said with a grin. We spent the night watching bad action movies and laughing at the over-the-top fight scenes. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to normal. Before he left, Ben turned to me, his face serious for once. You're doing the right thing, he said. Standing up for yourself. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. I nodded, his words sinking in. For too long, I'd let Rachel's family walk all over me, but not anymore. This time, I was fighting back, and I wasn't going to stop until I got justice. The trial date came faster than I expected, and with it, the anxiety I'd been pushing down for weeks. My lawyer had been preparing me for this, walking me through every detail of what to expect, but nothing could fully prepare me for facing them again. Greg, Tyler, Matt, and Diane. All the people who had tried to ruin my life would be sitting in that courtroom, and I'd have to relive everything they'd done. The morning of the trial, I woke up early, my stomach churning. Ben showed up unannounced, holding coffee and a bag of donuts. "You're not going in there alone," he said, plopping down on my couch. I couldn't help but smile. "You're not the courtroom type, you know." He shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Someone's gotta be there to cheer when they get what's coming to them." At the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. Greg and his sons were sitting together, their lawyer whispering furiously at them. Greg looked uncomfortable in his too-tight suit, and Tyler was glaring at everyone who walked by, clearly trying to keep up his tough guy act. Matt just sat there, staring at the floor like he wished he could disappear. Diane was off to the side, looking every bit the picture of someone who thought she was above all this. She was dressed impeccably, her hair perfect, but there was a tightness in her jaw that gave her away. She wasn't as calm as she wanted people to believe. Rachel wasn't there. I didn't know if it was because she couldn't bring herself to face me, or because she knew she'd only make things worse. Either way, her absence felt like both a relief and a painful reminder of how things had fallen apart. The prosecutor opened with a clear and devastating argument, laying out the evidence piece by piece. First came the photos of my injuries, taken the night of the assault. Then they presented the text messages and emails from the USB drive Mark had given me. Watching it all laid out so methodically felt surreal, like I was outside of my own life, watching someone else's nightmare unfold. Mark testified, too. He didn't hold anything back. He told the court how Diane had orchestrated the entire scheme, hiring the photographer, fabricating the story, planting doubts in Rachel's mind. He explained how she'd manipulated everyone around her, pulling strings behind the scenes until everything unraveled. "She's been doing this for years," Mark said, his voice steady. "It's always about control with Diane. This time, she just went too far." When it was my turn to testify, I took a deep breath and focused on staying calm. I described the attack in detail, how they barged into my apartment, ignored my attempts to explain, and physically assaulted me while Rachel stood by and did nothing. I talked about the aftermath, the hospital visit, the sleepless nights, and the overwhelming sense of betrayal. The defense tried to paint a different picture, of course. They argued that Greg and the brothers had acted out of emotional distress, claiming they'd been protecting Rachel. Diane's lawyer tried to spin her involvement as a misguided attempt to help her daughter. But none of it held up. The evidence was too strong. The texts, emails, and receipts showed exactly what had happened and who was responsible. When the verdict was read, guilty on all charges, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Greg and his sons were sentenced to prison time for aggravated assault. Diane got a lighter sentence for conspiracy, but the criminal record would follow her for the rest of her life. As they were led out of the courtroom, Greg glared at me one last time, but there was no power behind it anymore. The smug confidence he'd had that night in my apartment was gone. Diane didn't even look my way, keeping her head held high like she was trying to hold on to what little dignity she had left. Afterward, Ben and I went to a diner to celebrate. It wasn't anything fancy, just burgers, fries, and a couple of beers, but it felt like a victory. "To standing up for yourself," Ben said, raising his glass. "To moving the hell on," I replied, clinking mine against his. The next few days were quieter than I expected. The calls and texts from Rachel's family stopped completely, and even Rachel herself seemed to have finally let go. I didn't hear from her again, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. I wasn't naive enough to think the scars from all this would disappear overnight. I still had moments where I'd catch myself replaying the attack in my head, or wondering how things could have been different if Rachel had just trusted me. But those moments were becoming less frequent, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was in control of my life again. The chapter with Rachel and her family was finally closed. Now, it was time to start writing a new one. In the weeks following the trial, life finally started to feel like it was mine again. For so long, I'd been stuck in this whirlwind of betrayal, anger, and legal battles. But now that it was over, the silence felt almost foreign. There were no more calls, no more emails, no more reminders of Rachel or her family. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects, and even volunteering to mentor a few new hires. It was a good distraction, and for the first time in months, I felt productive instead of reactive. I started hitting the gym more often too, not just to blow off steam, but to actually focus on feeling stronger, physically and mentally. Ben, of course, made sure I didn't retreat into complete solitude. "You need to get out," he'd say, dragging me to trivia nights, hiking trails, or even just grabbing beers at the local pub. At first, it felt like he was pushing too hard, but eventually, I started to enjoy it. One night, after a trivia win, mostly thanks to Ben's bizarre knowledge of 90s sitcoms, he turned to me and said, "You know, you're allowed to start fresh, right? This doesn't have to define you." I nodded, but I don't think it really sank in until later. A few weeks after the trial, I got an email from Mark. I almost ignored it, thinking it might just reopen wounds I was trying to heal, but curiosity got the better of me. It was short and to the point. "I just wanted to say I'm glad you stood your ground. Diane's been running people's lives for years, and you were the first to stop her. I'm sorry for everything you went through, but I'm also grateful you didn't back down. Take care of yourself." I stared at the screen for a while after reading it. Mark didn't owe me anything, but his words carried a weight I hadn't expected. It was a strange kind of validation. Not that I needed it, but it reminded me why I fought back in the first place. As the months went by, the anger I'd been holding onto started to fade. It wasn't forgiveness, not for Diane, not for Greg or the brothers, and definitely not for Rachel, but it was something closer to acceptance. What happened was terrible, but it was done. I couldn't change it, but I could make sure it didn't define who I was going forward. Eventually, I started dating again. At first, it was awkward. I was hyper-aware of everything, whether I was being too cautious, too guarded, or too eager to please. But then I met someone who reminded me what it was like to laugh without overthinking, to feel comfortable just being myself. We took things slow, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to rush to prove anything. She wasn't Rachel, and that was the best thing about her. One evening, as we were walking back from dinner, she asked me about the scar on my cheek, a faint reminder of that night with Greg and his sons. I hesitated, wondering how much to share. "It's a long story," I said finally. She smiled. "I've got time." So I told her, not all at once but in pieces, the way I was still processing it myself. She listened without interrupting, without judgment, and when I finished, she just nodded. "That sounds awful," she said, "but you made it through. That says a lot about you." I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that until she said it. Now, looking back, I don't regret standing up for myself. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it reminded me of my own worth. I'd spent too much time ignoring red flags, convincing myself that love could fix everything, when the truth was, love without trust and respect isn't love at all. Rachel and her family are a part of my past, but that's where they'll stay. The life I'm building now doesn't include them, and it never will. For anyone reading this who's stuck in a toxic situation, here's what I've learned. You're stronger than you think. Don't let anyone make you feel small or convince you that you're powerless. You have every right to stand your ground, even if it feels like the hardest thing in the world. Because when you do, you'll realize something. The life waiting for you on the other side is worth every second of the fight.